Welcome to Storytelling and Beyond, where emotions meet lessons, and every story touches the heart in ways words alone cannot. Today's story dives deep into the unseen storms that brew behind the closed doors of a seemingly peaceful home, a story of silent clashes, quiet endurance, and the strength it takes to bring harmony where tension threatens to grow. In a quiet suburban neighborhood draped in the soft hues of an early autumn afternoon, stood a modest yet charming house with ivy creeping along its wooden fence. Inside lived Ethan, a man known for his kind soul and calming presence, his newlywed wife Olivia, warm-hearted, soft-spoken, and filled with hope, and his mother Margaret, a proud, traditional woman weathered by life's trials. At first glance, it seemed like the three shared a simple domestic life. But beneath the surface, an invisible crack had begun to stretch. Margaret, who had raised Ethan on her own after her husband's passing, had always imagined a daughter-in-law who mirrored her values, respected her unspoken rules, and didn't disrupt the rhythms she had lived by for decades. Olivia, though graceful and sincere, came with her own sense of individuality. She was loving, modern, and tried her best to mold herself into the family, even as the walls around Margaret's heart stayed firmly locked. Margaret rarely confronted Olivia openly. She didn't have to. Her disapprovals were expressed in sighs, in quiet rearrangements of whatever Olivia did, and in small dismissive comments like, "We used to do it differently in our time." Olivia, raised with the strength of silence and dignity, chose not to react. She brewed Margaret's favorite chamomile tea each night, made small gestures of care, and never let a harsh word slip her lips, even as the emotional burden grew heavier with each passing day. Ethan, caught in the middle, was not blind to the growing distance. He often found Olivia quietly wiping tears in the kitchen or staring blankly into the garden where she once found peace. Margaret, too, grew quieter, not out of guilt but from the gnawing realization that her son had drifted emotionally, not from her, but from the home he once cherished. One afternoon, Olivia prepared a simple but hearty lunch: roasted tomato soup with grilled cheese sandwiches, a favorite from Ethan's childhood. As she set the table, Margaret entered the dining room, glanced at the meal, and offered a cold comment, "Looks like dinner for children, not adults." Olivia looked up, her hands trembling just slightly. "I thought something light might be nice. It's chilly today." Margaret sat without responding. Ethan arrived moments later, sensing the chill in the room that had nothing to do with the weather. He looked at both women, neither of whom would meet the other's eyes. The soup grew cold as silence took over. That night, as the lamps dimmed and shadows danced along the wallpaper, Ethan found Olivia in the study, curled up in a blanket with a book she wasn't really reading. He sat beside her, took her hand gently, and said, "I see what's happening. And I promise, it's going to change." Olivia didn't cry or respond. She simply nodded, as if clinging to that one thread of hope. This was no longer just about differences or unspoken rules. It was about a man realizing the silent battle his wife fought every day and deciding that love wasn't just about choosing sides, but building bridges. And that choice was going to change everything. The morning sun rose slowly, casting golden streaks through the half-drawn curtains. The light filtered gently into the living room, touching on old photo frames, worn cushions, and a vase of wilted flowers on the mantel, each object holding a story, a memory, a piece of time now strained under silent tensions. The quietness of the house was thick, not peaceful, but tense. It was the kind of quiet that came after too many words had been left unsaid, and too many glances had turned away. Margaret stood at the kitchen counter, methodically chopping vegetables for the lunch she insisted on making alone. Olivia, sensing the moment, offered her help as she had so many times before. "Can I assist you with anything, Margaret?" she asked softly, her tone filled with genuine warmth despite the lingering chill between them. Margaret didn't even look up. "No need. I've been doing this long before you ever stepped foot in this house," she said curtly. Olivia took a breath, swallowed her pride, and nodded, retreating quietly toward the garden. She didn't want to create another awkward moment. But the words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were layered with a subtle rejection that seemed never-ending. Meanwhile, Ethan sat in his home office, scrolling through old photos on his phone. In one, Olivia smiled at the camera while planting herbs in the garden. In another, his mother proudly held his graduation certificate. Two women he loved, each dignified in their own way, but somehow unable to meet halfway. It pained him that the people closest to him were growing further apart, tied together only by their silent suffering. He stepped out and walked toward the garden where Olivia sat under the oak tree, eyes closed, her face tilted toward the sun like she was searching for peace in the warmth. Sitting beside her, Ethan didn't speak for a while. Instead, he let the wind carry their shared silence, until he finally whispered, "You're not invisible to me, Liv. I see everything you do." Olivia opened her eyes, her lashes damp with emotion she tried not to show. "I'm not asking her to like me. I just wish she'd see I'm not trying to replace her." Ethan nodded slowly. "I know. And I think it's time she hears that from me too." Back inside, Margaret stood in the kitchen, stirring the pot as steam rose, fogging her glasses. She wasn't a villain, not in her heart. She was a woman who had known loss and fear and had built her life around protecting what she had left. But in doing so, she had let fear rule her emotions. And that fear had turned into quiet bitterness. Ethan walked in and stood beside her. "Mom," he said gently, "do you remember how hard it was when Dad passed? How you told me the only thing that helped you get through was being seen and heard by someone who didn't judge you?" Margaret turned to look at him, confused by the sudden shift in tone. "That's what Olivia's been waiting for. Not your approval. Just your understanding," he added. Margaret didn't respond right away. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the heat off under the pot. She didn't speak, but her eyes softened. Perhaps she hadn't seen things clearly, or maybe she had and just didn't want to face them. But now, for the first time, Ethan had voiced what needed to be said. The cracks were still there, and healing wouldn't be instant. But it was the beginning of a shift, a soft turning of hearts. And for a home caught between silence and sorrow, even a whisper of change felt like the sound of hope. The rain began to fall just as evening approached, light at first, then steady and cold, tapping softly on the windows like a reminder that not all storms are loud. Inside, the house was dimly lit, warm but heavy with unspoken feelings. The smell of the evening tea drifted from the kitchen, a mixture of cardamom and familiarity. Margaret sat at the edge of the couch, staring absently at a photo of her late husband. Olivia moved quietly, placing the teacups on the table, one near Margaret, the other where Ethan usually sat. She didn't say anything, just gave a small nod and moved toward the window, standing there in silence. Ethan returned from work, shook off his coat, and immediately noticed the shift in the air, subtle, but different. He walked over to the table, picked up his cup, and then looked at both women. He wasn't sure what had happened during the day, but something had changed. Olivia's silence was no longer strained, and Margaret's usual stiffness seemed less pronounced. Still, no words had been exchanged, just small gestures that spoke in their place. Later that night, as Margaret folded laundry in her room, she found an old scarf. It was hand-stitched, slightly faded. Olivia had gifted it to her on her birthday the previous year, but she had never used it. At the time, it felt like a forced courtesy. But now, holding it in her hands, something in her heart stirred. The stitching was imperfect, but the care was clear. It had been made with intention, not for show, but with love. Quiet, persistent love. She walked down the hall and gently knocked on Olivia's door. Olivia opened it, surprised to see her mother-in-law standing there with the scarf in her hands. "I found this while cleaning," Margaret said softly, avoiding Olivia's eyes for a moment. "It's warm. Thank you." Olivia looked at her, unsure how to respond. The moment was small, but meaningful. "I'm glad you like it," she whispered. Margaret hesitated, then added, "I'm not the easiest person to live with." "I know that. And I know you've been trying, even when I haven't made it easy." Olivia's eyes widened slightly, not expecting an apology or even acknowledgement. The heaviness in her chest lifted just a bit. Margaret stepped back, her voice a little more fragile now. "I suppose we both miss him in our own ways. And I've been guarding my space so hard, I didn't see how much you were giving." The silence that followed was not awkward, but tender. Olivia stepped forward and gently took Margaret's hand. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic breakdowns, just an acceptance that healing sometimes began with the smallest cracks in pride. Downstairs, Ethan watched from the stairwell, his heart easing. The conflict between the two most important women in his life had not vanished, but the walls were starting to crumble. And in the gentle silence that wrapped the house that night, there was a rare and quiet peace, one born not of victory, but of understanding. The following morning brought with it a golden hue that filtered gently through the lace curtains of the kitchen window. The smell of toast and freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Olivia was at the stove, carefully flipping pancakes, the same way she used to do at her mother's home. Margaret entered quietly, holding a small notebook and a pair of reading glasses perched on her nose. She paused, watching Olivia move, graceful, calm, humming softly to herself. Without speaking, Margaret reached into a drawer and took out 2 plates, placing them neatly on the table. Olivia looked over her shoulder, surprised again. Not by the act, but by the quiet collaboration that was beginning to form between them. It wasn't forced, nor was it overly cheerful. It was a simple understanding, 2 women learning to exist in the same space with respect instead of rivalry. As they sat together at the table, Ethan joined them, pretending to scroll through his phone to avoid interrupting the unusual but heartwarming moment. Margaret glanced at him and then at Olivia. "Did you add cinnamon to these?" she asked, taking another bite of the pancakes. Olivia nodded. "Just a little. My mother used to say it adds warmth." Margaret smiled faintly, a real one this time. She was right. "It's nice." After breakfast, the 3 of them found themselves sitting in the living room. Margaret was knitting, a habit she'd picked up again after years, and Olivia was organizing some family photos that Ethan had brought down from the attic. One photo caught Margaret's eye, a young Ethan standing between her and his late father. Her hand paused mid-stitch, and her expression softened. "I always wanted him to have a strong home," she said, almost to herself. "And I thought protecting him meant controlling everything." Olivia looked up slowly, her hands resting on the stack of photos. "He doesn't need protection now. He just needs love. From both of us." Margaret met her eyes, and there was no tension in her gaze. Just reflection. She nodded slowly, then turned back to her knitting. Later that day, Olivia went into town for groceries. When she returned, she found the living room cleaned, a vase of fresh flowers on the table, and a small card left near her handbag. In Margaret's careful handwriting were just a few words. "You are good for him. And maybe for me too. Let's try." Olivia read the note several times. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was something better, genuine, quiet, and full of hope. That evening, as they sat together once more, not out of obligation but out of choice, Olivia realized that the journey toward peace wasn't about one winning and the other losing. It was about letting go of pride long enough to build something real. And in that moment, under the soft hum of a quiet house, a new chapter silently began. As autumn deepened, the household settled into a rhythm that no one could have predicted months earlier. The early frost began to kiss the edges of the windows in the morning, and inside the home, the warmth no longer came just from the fireplace, it came from something deeper, something earned. One weekend, Ethan suggested a small family dinner to celebrate his upcoming work milestone. Olivia offered to cook, and to everyone's surprise, Margaret volunteered to help. Together, they moved in the kitchen like old companions, not perfect, but no longer in opposition. There were still small misunderstandings, occasional sighs and silences, but they were no longer sharp. They were simply human. When the dinner was finally served, it wasn't the elegant kind Margaret used to host with polished cutlery and stiff conversation. It was modest, heartfelt, full of laughter and honest exchanges. As they ate, Margaret raised her glass and looked at Olivia, her voice softer than anyone had heard it in a long time. "I may have been wrong about many things," she said. "But the one thing I see clearly now is that love can build bridges where pride once built walls." Olivia looked at her, eyes shimmering, and reached across the table. No words were needed. Margaret placed her hand gently over hers, sealing a peace that neither had expected but both had hoped for in their hearts. Ethan watched in quiet gratitude, a gentle smile curving his lips. His role hadn't been to force harmony, but to believe it was possible, and his patience had finally paid off. That night, the lights in the home glowed late into the evening, casting a golden hue on the walls where photographs of new memories had already begun to form. Olivia tucked Margaret in after she dozed off on the couch, placing a light blanket over her with the same care a daughter might offer a mother. As Olivia stood by the window watching the stars blink in the crisp night sky, she smiled to herself. Life was far from perfect, but it was real, and it was healing. And that's how the story ends, not with fireworks, but with the quiet strength of kindness, patience, and letting go of ego. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Storytelling and Beyond, where we bring you powerful tales that inspire, heal, and open doors to new perspectives. Your support keeps the stories alive. See you in the next one.